Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aero Space News Roundup. This for the week of 8th to 14th of February 2021. First of all, a happy Chinese New Year, welcoming to the Year of the Ox. This is a couple of days after Chinese New Year's Day. It's been a quiet several days in the industry, but nonetheless, a happy Chinese New Year to everyone. Also a happy Valentine's Day to those who are observing this day more in the West, I suppose. Before jumping into our news updates, just a special shout out to our close friends at Go Taikonauts and at spacewatch.global, two excellent sources for space industry news. This week, we're going to bring updates regarding an Asia NewSpace report published by the European Space Policy Institute, updates on the Chinese New Year Gala and the relevance for the space industry. But first, Jean is going to give us some updates on the Tianwen-1 Mars mission.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
Jean, take it away with Tianwen-1.
Thank you, Blaine, and a happy Chinese New Year to all our listeners. Definitely, I think the highlight of last week was the news about Tianwen-1, which successfully inserted itself into Martian orbit after traveling just hundreds of millions of kilometers between Earth and Mars. So what it did basically was fire its main thrust engine of 3,000 newtons during approximately 15 minutes, slowing it down sufficiently to be captured by the gravitational field of Mars. And now, while we're still in the very early stages of the Tianwen-1 mission, just arrived at Mars, but it's already a historical moment for China because it is making China the 6th country to ever put an orbiter around Mars in Martian orbit after obviously the US, Russia, Europe as a whole. We also had India and we have the UAE. And the UAE actually Martian insertion maneuver just took place a couple days ago with the HOPE mission. And all of this is also a couple days before the US Mars 2020 mission arrives at Mars. Now, admittedly, the Mars 2020 mission won't be putting anything into orbit around Mars as there's no orbiter component to the Mars 2020 mission. It's just directly landing on Mars with the Perseverance rover. So Tianwen-1 now is in a very elliptical orbit. It will stay there a couple of months. Initially, it was announced that it would stay 2-3 months in what is called an observational or reconnaissance period, where it will be taking multiple pictures of the landing sites. But in the latest publication that we see from CASC last week, we realized that now they're talking about May or June for the landing phase. So the reconnaissance phase will take probably more like 3-4 months. We don't know why there is this delay, but it's not time that's lost by Tianwen-1 because all of the instruments on board the orbiter, there are 7, such as cameras, spectrometers, magnetometers, and there are also others. They have all been switched on and are already gathering a lot of scientific data on Mars. And perhaps last point of interest here, we also got some fantastic footage from the CNSA during this insertion maneuver. So we normally have 2 footages. There's a camera that was locked on the solar panel, and there's another camera that was locked on the back of the high gain antenna. And on both videos, what you see is obviously the different parts of the Tianwen-1 spacecraft. But slowly, progressively, you see Mars loom into the field of view of the camera. And initially, Mars is a little bit overexposed, so you just see this basically a white sphere. But as the exposure is adapted, you start to see all the really very clearly the details of the Martian surface features. And I think you even see a little bit the Martian atmosphere. So that's definitely very, very interesting to see. And I think that you also see all vibrations that were said to be linked to the firing of the main thruster, making the whole Tianwen-1 spacecraft shake a little bit. So definitely, again, we're getting over the next few months, it's going to be very exciting for those that are a big fan of Martian videos and pictures, and definitely in higher resolution than how it was done in the past.
which transitions nicely into my takeaway from the Tianwen-1 updates this week. This is related to the content, not the thrusters. So this idea that I suspect over these next few months, or let's say 6 months even, we have these several different Mars missions that, as you mentioned, are approaching the red planet now. And we also have now a lot of people that are still on lockdown and who are doing more and more things online. And this is being combined, I think, with increasing political polarization in certain countries. Certainly in the US, I've been discouraged by that. And I think that people are looking for things to be inspired by, and things that are non-politicized, and things that are ultimately hopeful, if I can borrow a phrase from the UAE's mission. And so I do think that we're going to really potentially see, if not mass adoption of people watching live space industry, news feed related things. I mean, that would be probably unlikely, but I think we're going to see more and more people, getting interested in these Mars missions and then in space more generally, because I think that, as you said, we're starting to see more amazing things come from these missions. I mean, just incredible footage and incredible scientific discoveries and just really inspirational stuff. And as you also mentioned, these missions are there's some mileage to them, if you will. We are being kept waiting in certain instances, and there's some plot twists and etc. So I think we're going to see hopefully sustained interest, let's say, by if not the general public, by a larger percentage of the public than has previously been the case. So yeah, great stuff. Really good news. Anything else, John, on Tianwen-1 this week, or are we good to go into the ESPI report?
All good.
Excellent. So our second piece of news from the week, not necessarily China specific, but we have a report published by the European Space Policy Institute, so ESPI, based out of Vienna, entitled New Space in Asia. And we bring up this report for a couple of different reasons. So for the slightly selfish reason that both of the Dongfang Hour co-hosts, John and I, were contributing authors for the China chapter, along with our excellent friends at Go Taikonauts, so Jacqueline Mir and Chen Lan, two of the most foremost experts on the Chinese space industry, the most foremost, indeed. That's they'll have to put that in their CVs, that they're the most foremost. Anyway, digressing, really interesting report, very lengthy, 128 pages. I have not had time to dig into all of it, but I certainly know about 20 or 25 pages quite well, having contributed to the China section. But notably, so we have a couple of different major sections. So there's sort of the big three, as ESPI characterizes them. So that would be Japan, China, and India. These are the three kind of largest new space industries in Asia, and each of these three have a pretty in-depth chapter. All of these chapters are written, I would say, by experts in the respective industries. So the Indian chapter is written, I believe, primarily by Naranya Prasad, I believe his name is. He's from an Indian New Space sort of company. There's a few other chapters written by similarly expert people in their markets. I would say from a kind of big picture perspective, this report is quite significant because I think as space is becoming a bigger topic globally, this is occurring while the center of economic growth is continuing to shift from west to east. So the US and the European Union remain very, very large economies and very advanced space industries. But I would say for the next 50 or 100 years, it seems likely that the faster regions of growth more generally are going to be in the sort of developing world and in Asia. And therefore, as space becomes a bigger thing, it's probable that we're going to see a lot of innovation going on in space from these countries. So I think it's worth a look just to better understand these very different ecosystems and these different Asian space economies. And again, China being a very big part of that. And we're always happy to contribute to such reports. A couple of sort of highlights that I think are worth mentioning. So eye-catching was the fact that in Europe, apparently, and this I'm not an expert on the European space industry, so I take ESPI at their word on these funding numbers, and I make no promises that the funding numbers are accurate, although I have no reason to believe they're not accurate. Digressing, top line funding in Europe for commercial space companies, from 2019 to 2020, it apparently increased from about 200 million euros to about 500 million euros, so like 2.5 times increase, which is particularly impressive given that 2020 was a pandemic year. So that was pretty surprising. And I mean, I guess it broadly, I mean, it sounds about right. I know ISAR Aerospace had a very big round of funding in the later part of the year. I think it was like 70 million euros. So that alone is a big part of that. But anyway, about 500 million euros in commercial space funding in Europe. The other thing I think it's worth noting about that number is that it is roughly equal to Chinese space industry funding in 2020. It's actually a little bit less, but same order of magnitude. So as we saw in the report, in the Chinese space industry, 2020 saw about 4.5 billion RMB. So that would be about perhaps 550, 600 million euros of funding. So again, first takeaway is that if we look at the European space industry, it's growing very fast, 2.5 times in terms of total funding over these last 2 years. And it's roughly equal to China in terms of funding in, say, 2020 for commercial space companies, which is not to say it's equal to China or that China is equal to Europe in space industry terms more generally. The second big takeaway from the report, I think, is the differences between different countries' new space ecosystems and how this kind of reflects the differences between the broader economies. So the one really particular example, and this is kind of cherry picking to some extent, I acknowledge that, but I think there's some truth to this, is if we look, there's a chart in the Japanese space industry section that shows fundraising for space companies globally and fundraising for space companies in Japan over a different time series. So the global one is from 2020 to 2017. The Japanese one is 2014 to 2020. So it is imperfect, but still these are fairly long time periods. And the big takeaway is that globally, most space companies are funded by like VC, venture capitalists or angel investors. Like 70% of the funding is coming from these two types of companies. And in Japan, almost half comes from corporations, which corporations globally are about less than 20%. And in Japan, their angel investors are non-existent. And so this is probably due to a couple of things. So Japan has a history of quite strong corporations, so the Zaibatsu, so you have companies like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries or these very large trading companies. They control a relatively large percentage of the economy, and they're quite strong in their industries, and they have a lot of capital. So I think that these companies are doing a lot of the funding of Japanese commercial space companies. And one example that comes to mind is Axel Space, which is one of the leading Japanese commercial Earth observation companies. They have a sort of partnership of sorts with Mitsui Sumitomo, I believe, some Mitsui, one of the Mitsui family of companies, the large Zaibatsu Mitsui, which is a trading company. And Mitsui had given Axel Space some land in Nihonbashi to build a headquarters. On this land, they had helped them to find some different uses for their Earth observation data in some of the Mitsui Corporation's diverse set of businesses. So again, I think the takeaway here is that different countries' space industries are going to develop in very different ways based on the way that their economies are structured. And so again, if we look at Japan specifically, we have a handful of very, very large companies that are going to probably have a pretty big influence on the way that the commercial space sector evolves. This is probably going to be fairly similar in South Korea, where we have the Chaebol, and we have in the report, they mention several of the usual South Korean suspects. You have Hanwha mentioned, also what is the other one? Duwon and LIG Group, which is a Korean defense conglomerate. So we have these big Korean companies. And again, I think we're going to then see these companies have a pretty big influence on the way that the commercial space industry develops in these countries. And I think that's different from, say, the US, where the sort of the commercial companies have a little bit more freedom and have a little bit more ability to raise from capital markets that are perhaps independent of the existing space industry. And just one last, I guess, point about these couple of countries that have these very large companies getting involved. We had mentioned in the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace News Roundup episode 14 from 28th of December to 3rd January, that week, about Hanwha's investment into Kaimeta, which is a flat panel antenna manufacturer. And again, Hanwha being mentioned in this ESPI report as one of the leading sort of large corporations in South Korea that is now getting involved in the space sector. So one very, very last point from my side on this ESPI report, and then I will finally turn it over to Jean. it's great to see profiles of some of the less publicized space industries in Asia. So there was a chapter about Malaysia, a chapter about Thailand, two countries that have historically had a lot of activity in the SATCOM sector. So Malaysia has MEASAT, it's the national satellite operator, and Thailand with Thaicom, but that have also been trying to diversify their space activities and increase their space activities. So good to see. Overall, a lot of good profiles, very, very good report. I expect in the future to see countries like Singapore, Australia, Philippines being included in these reports because they all have a lot of impetus in space now. But yeah, overall, really good report. Jean, anything to add from your side?
Well, that was a very good sum up, I think, of why our listeners and viewers should give the report a read if they have some time. Definitely, I think that you don't find that much information or that at least that many papers that are focused on this perhaps less visible countries around the world in the space industry. So as you mentioned, Thailand, even Chinese space, you don't have that many reports that are focused on Chinese space. And what you have here in the ESPI report is all these chapters on these different countries in Asia that are put together in one report. So definitely if space in Asia is your thing, have a read of that report. Now, I don't have that much to add. Maybe moving on to our next point this week. And to conclude the Dongfang Hour, as all of you know, and as Blaine, you mentioned it, it's the first week of the year of the ox. So most Chinese people today are away and from work, and they are with their family spending Chinese New Year. So traditionally, this is quite a slow week in terms of space news, and also next week will probably still remain slow, although Chinese space can definitely surprise us. But there are still some nice newsworthy elements that we can mention this week that's linked also to Chinese New Year. So first of all, we have a lot of Chinese space companies that send out the traditional Chinese New Year artwork, and it's always interesting to see how they try to link topics linked to space and also Chinese New Year. So this year, linking rockets and perhaps an ox in the background of the artwork. So I'll put a few up on YouTube for you to realize what I'm talking about. And second piece of news here that's perhaps the more interesting one is about the New Year Gala, the Chinese New Year Gala. And this is something that we have every year in China. It's this massive show where you have performances, you have songs, you have plays, you have speeches, you have all these things put together during the gala that probably lasts over 2 or 3 hours. And in terms of audience, I would probably compare it to the Super Bowl in the US, although it's very different topics. But I feel that literally every household in China is watching it during Chinese New Year, or at least has the TV on, even though they're doing something else. And what is interesting this year for the New Year Gala is we had 3 minutes that were specifically dedicated to space. So the presenter, he invited on stage 4 of the chief designers of the very large Chinese space programs. And just to give a few names here, we had Yang Mengfei of the Chang'e 5 program. We had Zhang Bainan, who's the chief designer of the crewed spacecraft program. We have Xie Jun of the Beidou program. And we also had Sun Zezhou of the Tianwen-1 program. And so we actually even had, I think, Chang'e 5, the return capsule, in the background of the stage. So definitely a lot of effort that was put into those 3 minutes. And what these 4 chief designers were doing was bringing good news to the Chinese people through the gala. So just to give a few examples, so Yang Mengfei, he announced, as we all know, that the lunar samples were successfully returned on Earth. We had Zhang Bainan announce that the next generation crewed spacecraft would be even safer than the current generation spacecraft, the Shenzhou. We had Xie Jun of the Beidou program announce that, the Beidou program was now 100% designed and manufactured in China. And we had Sun Zezhou for Tianwen-1, who announced that the spacecraft had successfully inserted, as you know, into Martian orbit a couple of days ago. And so that's the good news. And when you look at this and you take a step back, you realize how, first of all, how big the Chinese space program has become, because all those things, all that good news, all those programs that I just mentioned were things that were completed in the last 12 months. So just realize how much is going on. And the second point maybe is looking at how the staging, how the music is done, what the different presentators are saying. You realize also how the Chinese and how China is extremely proud of their space program and how it symbolizes somehow the rejuvenation of China from a technological point of view. And so I think it's definitely a very interesting 3 minutes to look from multiple perspectives. And just before I hand it over to Blaine, maybe we'll put on a short extract of those 3 minutes on Chinese space, just to give you a grasp of what we're talking about.
为我们探索宇宙奥秘又打开了一扇新的大门。这是一次新的胜利，也是一个新的起点。今天我们请来了几位特殊的嘉宾来到春晚的现场，和大家一起过年，而且他们还为我们带来了一位特别的战友，让我们掌声欢迎他们。
我是天问1号火星探测器系统总设计师孙泽洲。我宣布一个好消息，就在25小时之前，天问1号成功被火星捕获。
谢谢你们带来的好消息，大家辛苦了，给你们拜年了。亲爱的朋友们，航天精神始终是中国航天成功的密码。我们相信，走出地球摇篮半个多世纪的中国航天，必将乘着梦想的风帆，向着星辰大海的更深处，不断的进发。
Yeah, and to let you hear the Hao Xiaoxi for yourself. Yeah, it's an interesting 3 minutes, and so I mean a couple of takeaways from my side. So definitely, China it seems space is being kind of elevated to a more, let's say, more politically important or more kind of nationalistically important, let's say, topic in China. But I think it's being done so in an extremely traditional way. So one takeaway, obviously, was that the presenter of the gala, he has a very nice New Year's tuxedo on, and then all 4 of the people from the Chinese space program are wearing their matching casque blue kind of overalls with the Chinese flag, and they all look as though they've just come from mission control. And I mean, basically, it looks very humble is not the right word, but very dutiful. It looks like these guys are basically they're just on duty constantly, and they're just ready to serve their country in whatever way they need to do, and basically using a lot of pretty expected phrases that are kind of traditional. I mean, again, this is you've had a lot of well, I mean, yeah, it's noteworthy, I think, that all 4 of the representatives from the space program were wearing the traditional blue overalls of casque, and yeah, as we saw at the very end of the presentation, when the presenter was kind of bidding them farewell, he gave the kind of expected end of the 大家辛苦了，给你们what is it? 给你们拜年了. So basically saying, 辛苦你们了, like, so, you've all worked so hard, and it's kind of a, I don't know if that really captures 辛苦你了, this kind of, this saying of I don't know, it's like, wow, you've worked so hard for your country and for your people, for the people, and it was really just very kind of patriotic in that way. It will be really, it'll be interesting to see whether in a couple of years' time we start to see some commercial space companies on the New Year's Gala. But I think for the meantime, it was a very traditional coming out party for the space industry in the general mindset of the Chinese people. So really a cool few minutes. Definitely some very good news from a lot of these different different programs. And as you said, Jean, a comment on how large and how diverse the Chinese space industry and the Chinese space program has become. But yeah, certainly very traditional. So yeah, if unless you have anything else from your side, John, or are we about good for the week? All right. Well, this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aero Space and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 8th to 14th of February 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host John DeVille, and thank you very much for watching or listening. See you next time, and Happy New Year.
Thanks for watching. Happy New Year. Bye.